Good afternoon, and welcome to Airmic's third in a series of 5 webinars on the topic of digital transformation. My name is Kim Lee, and I am Research and Development Manager here at Airmic, and I'll be setting the theme for today's webinar. I'm very pleased to welcome our presenter for the day, Freddie Linhart, who is Vice President, Digital and Smart Analytics at Swiss Re Group. Following last week's webinar, which looked at the risks and opportunities of the Internet of Things, Freddie will focus on big data. He will give an overview of how big data is used and some of the biggest risks that risk managers should be aware of. Before I hand over to Freddie, I have a few housekeeping announcements to make. As ever with our webinars, this is an interactive seminar, and you are all invited to join the discussion and ask questions anytime throughout the course of today's webinar. You can do this via the GoToWebinar control panel, which is usually located to the right of your screen. Scroll down to the Question tab, type your question in the allocated box, and submit it by selecting Send privately. If you can't see your GoToWebinar control panel anytime throughout today's presentation, then please click on the orange arrow on the right of your screen. We will also be polling you during the course of the webinar and presenting the results straight away, so please do participate. And lastly, the slides are available for you to download from the GoToWebinar control panel under the Handout tab. So that's all from me for now. It's over to you, Freddie, to take us through the rest of today's presentation.
Kim, thank you so much. It's a big honor to be on this webinar, and I'm happy to talk you through a topic around big data and what's the view from a risk management point of view. Maybe a few words to my person. So my name is Freddie Linhart. I've been now for the last 13 years in Swiss Re in a number of roles in the group, but as well in corporate solutions. Prior to that, I had some experiences in business consulting in the area of e-business, as well as having worked for a startup company, the Silicon Valley, on security. As you see, I'm still here working, so I was not one of the lucky ones who were able to vest his options and get rich. But nevertheless, it was a very good experience to see a bit the dynamics and the innovation, pace of innovation in the Silicon Valley, and that coupled with the other experiences helped me a lot to actually deep dive into this topic of big data and smart analytics. Good. So let me start with an introduction. So you see on the next slide, you see an overview on how we look at risk in general. So we have, on one hand, we have the most insurable risks on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side, we have the less insurable risk or not insurable risk. So if we click next, then we have the view, first of all, of the underwriter. So there's the underwriter's perspective of that, and obviously that will focus mostly or only on what is really insurable. But then we have also the technology perspective, which focuses on the technology. And now the big question is, and that's when you go a step further, we see that there is an impact or influence or a dynamic area between these two things. So we can observe it, and I think in the future even more, the technology has an impact on this orange square, which means it can move it to the left or to the right. So there might be risks which are today not insurable, and due to technology and its impact, including data and smart analytics, it might become insurable. But it might be also the other way around, because you could also look at it also not from an insurable and not insurable perspective, but also from a risk appetite. So there might be risks which are really becoming so big that they are difficult to insure, not because they're not insurable, but because the insurance industry is not willing to take them into their books. So there's a dynamic, and it's difficult to see what is going to happen there, but we see already today, we see a couple of things popping up, and therefore the intention is really in this conversation today, this presentation is really this dynamic area. Now if we go a step deeper, on the next page, you see a number of technologies which will impact risk. If we go to the first one, bio, so we have biosensors, we have biotechnology, genomics, and neuroscience. Yes, this is a dynamic area as well, but if you look at others like materials or we look at energy, they are all important and they will all influence risk. But there's one which is much more dynamic and will have much more impact, in particular behavioral, is digital, which is the last one of the four. Digital, which includes mobility, cloud, IoT, but also artificial intelligence, also the whole topic of autonomy, and many more. This is something we experienced already in the last few years, today even more, in the future even more. This is something where we believe this will have not only an impact on efficiency and on cost savings and other things, innovation, but it will also have an impact on behavioral. And when we talk behavioral, I just learned today once more when I looked at risks in marine, and they told me that 70% of the risks in marine are driven by human error, so about behavior. So I believe in other industries there also could be also high numbers like this. So behavioral is really an important aspect of risk, and therefore when there is a transformation influencing something, we should definitely pay attention to. Good. Now, before we deep dive into insurance and before we bring the risk management perspective, the question is a bit, what is going on in industry and why is this all happening? So just to do sort of a step back and look at the industry, and also let's look at a couple of examples to illustrate a bit what could happen and what does it mean really transformation. So if we go to the 6 innovation accelerators, this is a slide which is actually not new. As you can see, it was published in 2014, so 3 years old. But when I looked through it, I realized it's even more than valid, and it's something which is happening today. So you see there are 6 accelerators described here, and I would like to deep dive a few a bit further. So we have security, we have cognitive systems, so there we find all the elements of cognitive computing, which I'm going to explain later on a bit more. Then we have Internet of Things, and here I would like to explain a few things. So Internet of Things, as you heard last week, it's a fast-moving technology. It's all about sensors, it's all about analytics, and it's all about transmission. And just to give you one example to see what's going on there, the transmission piece is a big enabler here, because you have these sensors in remote areas, and especially if you have a big plant, you want to be able to measure many things. Now, what's the problem today is the battery life. So if you have a sensor out there with mobile technology, it will last for 1 day and you have a problem unless you have power sources there. Now, there's new technologies out there being rolled out in 2017, which allow you to put a sensor somewhere connected to a single AA battery and will run for 10 years. Now, this is of course an average number. It might be also less in colder areas, but you see battery energy consumption has been driven down significantly due to new technologies of transmission. And we talk about up to 50 kilometers range. These telecom networks are being rolled out now and will be offered to companies to actually use in order to connect their sensors in a secure way. So we expect there the numbers of connection of such networks to outnumber the number of connections of mobility connections. And you know, mobility connection is also a big number, but we expect to see even more connections in that area than mobility, which means data, and which means risk assessment, be able to assess risk and be able to enable a few things we're going to talk about later on. So this is a very important element. Then we have 3D printing. We have natural interfaces, which focuses on the element of how we interact with the computer system. And we have robotics. Robotics, I believe, is also an important aspect here in this context. Why? Because, and that's something I learned recently, there are new categories of robotics or roboters called collaborative robotics. So these are roboters which can actually communicate with a human and interact. So these are not these big machines standing in a cage and you're not allowed to touch them. It's actually one which sits next to you on the desk and works with you face to face. They are not dangerous. They are easy to program, and they are less powerful than the big ones. They're less accurate, but they are much cheaper. And obviously they can take on or support you much more in your very repetitive work you have in an assembly line, for example. And if you believe the predictions of sales of such robots, then they are going to skyrocket in the near future. Now, if you think that a bit further, then the question is, what does it mean for this whole transformation? It means that supply chain or the whole manufacturing chain can be transformed significantly, as cheap labor is not anymore the main driving factor. It could be something else, and therefore you are more flexible in designing your whole manufacturing supply chain, which means you could bring things closer to your plant. And that means, again, we change the risk exposure of your firm or your company because you change that whole setup. So you see there are a number of accelerators here, coupled, of course, with the topic of mobility, with social media, social business, cloud, which access to computing power, storage capacity, and analytics is much cheaper than it used to be before. And of course, what we can do with big data and analytics coupled to that allows now industries to really innovate themselves, implement new business models, and do many more things. So this is sort of a big picture, but in order to illustrate that, I have an example which we find on the next page. This is maybe an example of an industry you haven't thought of unless you're yourself in that area. It's a soap producing company. So this company in Austria produces soap. So what they do, they produce this dispenser as well, where you get soap in your hands. They have also the paper dispenser and other things which you install in toiletries. Main areas for them are hospitals. They have huge quantities of toilets, as well as in football stadiums and other kind of event places. So you could think, okay, that's fine. They deliver their soap based on orders. They have a local storage, and then the cleaning equipment, the cleaning people take the soap and put it where it's empty. Now what they say, let's innovate. Let's install sensors. And you see in this right drawing, they installed lots of sensors into this box. Not just even it's empty, maybe also temperature, maybe the amount of people who have taken a piece of paper, and so on and so forth. So what they could do is they could actually predict now the consumption of soap. They could run the required storage, local storage, to almost zero, because everything was more just in time. Amount of car deliveries could be reduced, and so on and so forth. So obvious things. Now, this is for me, of course, not the innovation piece. This is a logical step to sort of improve logistics. Where it becomes really interesting is when they had the idea to actually install a door sensor. So if you go to the next illustration, you see a bit the whole value chain of what I'm explaining illustrated. So they installed a sensor at the door. So they could actually count the amount of people entering and exiting the toilet. Now, what could they measure with that? They could measure if people actually wash their hands. Now, is that interesting and important for a football stadium? Probably not. But for a hospital, this is huge, because hygiene is a huge topic in a hospital. You can imagine what happens if people don't wash their hands. Now, I'm not joking what I'm going to say now. They figured out that in a hospital, or in hospitals, only 80% of people actually wash their hands. So a soap producer was suddenly able to reveal a compliance-related insight. Unbelievable, thanks to technology. Now, they put then this data into a big washroom data cloud. They could probably pool other data from other installations from other hospitals, and probably also reveal or gain even more insights. But what was really interesting is if you spin this thought much further, then they could transform their business model from selling soap to sell hygiene. So, or even sell per use is another idea. So thanks to technology, thanks to data, this industry, which seemed to be sort of a boring industry, selling soap, could become suddenly a data provider, could suddenly become really somebody who does more than just soap. We actually care about hygiene. So this is just a very small illustrative example to show you, traditional industry technology what could it mean now in the future. And I believe similar examples, but in a complete different context, will show up where industries really invent themselves by implementing a new business model. And with that, I would like to hand over to Kim, because I would like to ask you a specific question about this case.
Great, thank you very much, Freddie. As you've just heard, there are a few key technologies that are transforming business models, and we'd like to ask you a question about that. So it's over to you, the audience. Has your risk exposures changed? And if yes, please select from the selection below. Okay, we're just about to share the results from the poll. If you haven't made your choice just yet, please do so now. So Freddie, looking at the results, there are the vast majority, 36%, believe that their reputational risk has increased. 29% believe their compliance risk has increased. 21% say it's business continuity risk. A further 7% believe the increases in business risk. And lastly, just 7% believe that there's been no changes at all. How does that surprise you?
I'm actually positively surprised, because believe me, in the discussions we have with our clients, but as well with the clients of our clients, the reputational risk is and this is really, I'm not just making this up, this is really one of the biggest concerns we hear, because besides that it's the biggest concern, it's also the one which is the most difficult to ensure, because reputational loss, you have a problem of evidence. How can you prove that a lost reputation is due to something which has happened before? It might be proven maybe in some cases, but in general it's really difficult, and it's also difficult to measure. But this is the biggest concern, because if you look at the cases in industry, so if something happens, it's usually reputation which comes first. Direct financial loss is depending, how fast it goes. So if you take here the example of the cloud, if the cloud goes down, which now becomes suddenly an essential piece of the value chain of this company, then you have obviously a business continuity problem, which is the third most voted one. But you have also the compliance risk, because suddenly you start to store data which you might not be so experienced with as a company. So this whole company is not so used with personal data. I know people come in and out and wash their hands, and I don't know, there's maybe some other data they add to it to increase the potential of insights, and suddenly they run also into compliance risks because they store data. Maybe they have this wash cloud in India, for example, and they're not aware of that this data should not be stored in India, because there are people, Americans, going in and out. So it can become very tricky, and that's why the compliance risk as well as the business continuity risk are also valid points, but the reputation risk is usually the one which comes first.
And Freddie, what would you say to the 7% who consider that there hasn't been any changes in their risk exposure?
I'm a bit surprised, because there is also something which we haven't added as an answer. I mean, it could be under business risk, which is the cyber risk. The question is, if now what happens if you are more exposed to the internet with some sort of a business model, and now you can technically be hacked. Now you could put that on the business continuity, you could put that on the business risk, so depending on you look at, but that's also an exposure which could technically become much bigger, and then related to that, of course, you have again the reputation risk. So it's a bit a complex bubble, but definitely the risk increases compared before. Now you have also opportunities, which we have seen before, the business opportunities. So you need to obviously see how you manage these new risks, what skills do you need, and that's what we're going to hear later on when we discuss a bit further in this presentation.
Brilliant. Should we move on to the next slide in that case?
Yes. Good. So before I turn to the insurance view, I would like to talk about the survey which I have come across just recently. There are a number of institutions, conferences which deal with the topic of Internet of Things, and there's one which just has sent out a survey to roughly 1,124 companies. These are all the people who have responded here are all sort of head of digital, chief digital officers, this kind of people who are close to the digital topic in all sorts of companies. We're talking here 24% manufacturing companies, but also telecommunications and others are represented here. And there were a number of results, and I would like to pick on maybe two results. One which is not shown here is there was the question, how far do you think are you in the development of technology in your industry? And only 25% roughly said they are full speed going on with it, which means amongst the leaders. There was a large amount of percentage saying we are still learning, and maybe 10% said we didn't even start with it. So it's not like that 60-70% would have said we are full in the game. It's still ramping up, and of course this is a mixed number across a number of industries. I believe in some industries much further than others, but it shows us yes, it's coming, but it's not as far as we thought. Now another result which is interesting is this slide here you see, and if you click one more time, there are a number of results we see here. I mean, as expected, almost 60% planning or are investing in new products. So the word new is important here. New features. Look at the car manufacturers as one example. But then what really struck me is the third line, and that's really interesting. This is add-on connectivity solutions for products already in the field. And that means that already the existing risk exposure will change, because with adding on connectivity, that means there will be this risk will be exposed to new risks. So basically increase your risk by having maybe increased cyber exposure, by having maybe accumulation issue with, let's say, if a blackout. So the possibility of a blackout, depending, of course, what industry we're talking about here. So you have much more interdependencies than you had before, and maybe also the speed and the speed of events might increase. So it's really important that whatever innovation is coming in, what technology is coming in, is to monitor and reassess what is our risks and are we still well prepared for what might happen. Good. So with that, I would like to change a bit gear and focus on the insurance view and give you a bit of overview on this topic. So when we talk about risks, then we talk not only about data. Big data is important, and on purpose I didn't tell you the story about big data, what is big data in detail, and the numbers behind it. I kept it quite small, but nevertheless it's important. We need to think about availability of data, the adequacy, the reliability, and also the compliancy of data. So we should not just start to collect data for whatever reason. We should really understand why are we doing this, and do we have the right data. So rather than big data, I would actually call it smart data, fit for purpose of what we are doing. Because if we start to collect data without reason, then I tell you it can also happen that we start to run into ethical issues or compliance issues without knowing. On the other hand, it's not enough to have the data. We need also to be able to analyze the data, which is in the upper right corner, the analytics piece. And for that, we need the capabilities, we need the skills. Now, you might say we can outsource that, but there my question is then what's about intellectual property? And you might think then, okay, that's maybe an asset we want to keep in-house and do it within the firm for intellectual property reasons, and therefore not give it to a third-party company, and then from there it could go to your competitors. So analytics has become really an important asset in a company, much more than it has been in the past. Whereas technology, which is required to do actually the analytics, is a bit different. And there are lots of cloud solutions, there are lots of technology providers, which technically you can outsource, but also there the problem is you create interdependency, and you need to make sure that you manage that accordingly. Plus, of course, the risk behind it, because when you start to work with other companies, you need to be aware of what kind of risk awareness do they have. The fourth element is the business model, and that's probably the most important one. When I recall back a couple of years ago when the topic of big data came up, then everybody talked about big data. Now, we need to gather data as much as possible, the more the better. But nobody asked about why and what's the business model behind it, what's the business value. And then the year afterwards, I remember the discussion was all about capabilities, analytics. We need to buy the best tools to analyze, whatever we can do, visualize and all the fancy features. And now, when I go to conferences and discussions, I realize now we are there where really companies start to talk about what's the business value, what's the business model, what can we really do with this insight. And based on that, you can then derive and see, okay, and now let's think about what capabilities do we need, what analytical methods we're going to use, what data do we need, and what technology we need to support that. Together with the business model, of course, we have the element of ethics, which is a very difficult one, and we have a couple of examples in a number of countries popping up where companies have done something legally, but the public outcry came because from an ethical point of view, it was not right. And that's, of course, a difficult path, especially when you start to deal with personal data, when you start to deal with things where you just collect data without purpose, and so on and so forth. Then we have on both sides, we have two more elements which should not be neglected. One is the regulatory environment. You operate in a regulatory environment, and the problem with that is regulatory environment is lacking behind technology innovation. So there might be new technological innovations, capabilities you can actually take advantage of, but the regulatory environment is not there yet to maybe put some regulation in place if required. And so you run the risk that you do something which is today legal, tomorrow not. And therefore it's important to look at that as well and hopefully be able to mitigate the regulatory risk as much as possible. And the last one, which is a strong development we have seen in general, but also from a Swiss Re perspective, the element of partnership has grown quite a bit. So we as a firm, we used to do a lot of things out in-house. And now in this new world of technology, we realized we are not a technology company. So there are lots of elements we actually work with partnerships together. And when you work with partnerships, then you deal also with new risks, which are around partnership risks, we call it. So for example, if there is data you don't host yourself, you don't own it, but you use a partner to access it, then of course this partner can also do something wrong with this data, and then you might also run into a reputation risk, although you haven't dealt with it directly. So you need to make sure when you build this ecosystem of something new here that you look at the risk not from only inside of your company, but also outside from a holistic point of view. Now let me deep dive two areas, one area, which is the analytics area on the next page. When we talk about analytics, and that's something which sometimes also I heard people don't fully understand. Analytics is just not one skill or one person or one role. It's actually a multitude of skills. As we have lots of types of data, from structured to unstructured, multidimensional, size, large, small, also different kinds of approaches. We have also lots of methods we can use actually to analyze this data. And you see here just an example. And the point is there's no method which can be used for everything, depending on the problem. And that's why it's important to understand what's the problem statement, what's the business value, what is it what we want to achieve, what data do we have available, and then what kind of method shall we use. Artificial intelligence, as cool as it sounds, as as fashionable as it is right now, it's a very hard technology to manage, and it's not the solution for everything. If I look further, for example, natural language processing, I think is one when you go through lots of text. Data mining is another one. So really, depending on what you do, you might use the one or the other method, and with that also you might have other people with other skill sets. In summary, we talk about three different types of analytics. We have the descriptive analytics, which describes a situation in the past. We have predictive analytics, which describes or tries to predict the future based on the past. And prescriptive analytics is then the sort of the science, analytical science, to give you decision support based on decision process you have and the base of data you have available to. So this is sort of in a nutshell a bit what is it behind when you talk analytics and data. Then on the next page, a high-level overview about cognitive computing, because it's often used and discussed. First of all, it's not an easy method to manage. It takes quite a bit of an investment. It's not only that you need a lot of data, but you also need to have the skills to actually manage the technology, and it can't just be installed and you go. And there are also different levels of artificial intelligence. So you see it starts with business intelligence, which is more the visualization piece, but then you have the machine learning, which is more in the area of prediction. Then you have the artificial intelligence, which focuses more on the support of decision making. And then you have the cognitive computing, which is more a term from IBM, and this focuses more on the human-machine interaction, with supported by cognitive computing. So it's a big field. There are also lots of players, and it's an interesting one. I believe there is a lot of value in there, and there's still a bit of way to go, and I'm very curious to see how far it will lead us in terms of being able to gain insights from the data we have. With that, I would like to switch over to a couple of examples, which we in Swiss Re have sort of run through, and they're small examples, but it gives you a bit of a sense of what can be done and what are the issues here. This is a life and health example, so it shows you a bit the issue of compliance in ethics. So in the US, when you buy life insurance, you need to actually do a fluid test, and we thought, okay, this is really ugly and costly, can we shortcut? So the question was, can we predict if somebody smokes or not? 20 to 50% of smokers don't disclose that they're smoking. Now, we phrased this idea and the lawyers almost killed us. They said, no way, this is not ethical, you're not allowed to even think about this idea. Now, if we stopped there, then I would not be able to present you what we did. Obviously, we ignored the lawyers and we said, no, nevertheless, let's try it. And I think this is a big encouragement. When you have a crazy idea, even if it's super crazy, if you don't do it, then you don't know if it worked or not. Now, of course, not to go in production and go to life in the market, but in a pilot or a research and development environment, you can try out some things. So what happened? We failed 3 times because the data was not good. We used social media data to predict smoker behavior based on a couple of elements from the applicants. It was not good enough. But what happened is then over time, we realized we need to change the question. So instead of asking, well, can I predict if somebody smokes or not, we changed the question to say, can we predict if I ask you if you smoke or not, that you lie? So it's really, I ask you, you give me an answer, yes or no, you might lie, and I predict what's the likelihood that you lie. Result is the same. We got rid of the ethical issue we had, and we managed to really build a model which worked. And if the model was not the same answer like the answer from the applicant, then we sent the person to the doctor for a fluid test, and something people might not know, also the fluid test has a 7% error rate. This shows you just a question, an example how innovation can work, with a stupid idea, and then how you can actually work it through and make it happen. Now we are running a pilot in the market and see if we can actually bring this into production. This is one example. The second example is, we call it the global motor risk map. The point here is in markets like China and Brazil, there's little data about motor insurance, just in general. The motor insurance market has opened, and now the question was, how can you build a tariff? And for that, we need a sort of an accident prediction model in order to use that not only for tariffs, but also for the portfolio steerings and for reserving and other things. Now, how do you do something if you have no data? There's no GDP, there's no, there were little maps, there was really little information. So one little example, without going to details, we used satellite images here, and those which are shot at night, so you see the light intensities of cities. And we used the light intensity measure of each city in China and used that to predict GDP. Now, is that accurate? Of course not. But is it good enough? Yes. And this is a nice example to show you that big data and smart analytics does not always need to be accurate. It can just point you to a certain level, and it's good enough that you can use it for what we did here. Of course, this was not the only factor. We used lots of map information, road curves, and other things in order to come up then with an accident prediction model. So basically, the story is here: how can you find non-insurance or non-risk related information and make it risk related? Good. And with that, I would like to turn to the last example I have here, and this is an example from the manufacturing or construction industry. This is a company who specializes on smart analytics in the workplace safety. And the question they asked is, can technology and data be leveraged to improve safety performance and increase the accuracy of risk modeling? Now, I'm sure you have in manufacturing areas and other areas, you have lots of safety inspections and hazard management and incident management and trainings and whatever is required in order to keep a workplace safe. Now, what they do is they have built an app to actually manage that whole process, to capture data, one hand manually, so when something was done like a training, you put the tick in, or by sensors. So there are sensors on helmets, so when you put the helmet on, there are sensors on gloves, on clothing, on shoes, in the environment. So there's a number of things which you can measure, and some just by human input, and which helps you then to sort of capture this data around work safety. And now the question is, can you build a machine learning algorithm in order to actually create a risk score? So if we go to the illustration, you see here an example. They use more than 60 data points, and you see we talk heart rate, hazards, fatigue, temperature, and a number of other things, and then coupled, of course, with a number of parameters, they could then also report back on one hand to the employee directly, hey, there's something missing, or you should do this and go out of this zone or whatever, and also to the plant management, for example, to take action. Question is, of course, here also, is there an angle to insurance? And of course there is. Can this now be used to build a dynamic insurance product? Can this used to do risk assessment? So the question is, and this is just one example, is how can this be helped to reduce your risk on one side? On the other side, how can this maybe enable insurer to maybe build a more specific product or more tailored product? They are now starting up. They have roughly, I think, of 1,500 sites installed, and mainly construction and manufacturing. And this is just one vendor, and I see more and more popping up similar concepts, but not only workplace, also other ideas where you collect data, you create insights, and you provide a value back to the company. Good. With that, I would like to get to the conclusion, and with that, I would like to hand over to Kin for the next poll.
Great. So, audience, it's over to you for another short poll. So when it comes to digitalization and big data, how well do you think your company is managing the related risks? You make your selection now. Okay, we are about to share the results. So if you haven't made your votes, do so now. So Freddie, looking at these results, you can see that the vast majority, 79%, are still learning. And the rest of our respondents are 7% behind the curve, 7% actively adopting, and 7% among the leaders. So if we just address that 7% behind the curve first, why are companies so behind the curve?
I think it's maybe also a cultural issue, and this is not to blame anybody. And maybe I need to give you a quick example which just comes to mind. There's a cultural issue, and I think there's also an economic issue, depending on how you look at it from a risk perspective. Sometimes there's an economic hurdle to actually invest into risk mitigation. I give an example. There's the issue of the car key. So when you buy a modern car, a car manufacturer will invest much more into making a car good looking and packed it with lots of features rather than increase the security of the car. Now, not the safety. Of course, driving a car in a safe way, that's of course very important. That's why you have all these assistance systems. But now I'm talking about theft in this particular case. There is an easy way to hack the car when you come with a car with a key which is contactless. And with an antenna, you can capture the radio signal, you can get the code, and then next time you can hack the car without the key. This is a known thing. This is not unknown, but it costs quite a bit to change that. And they rather invest the money into really perceived value increase, which means the features of the car, then investing in something where they say, if the car is stolen, then the insurance will pay and we can sell another car. So there might be some elements which are related to economics, and then there's another element which is probably just the culture. They're just not used to deal with this. So if you take the soap producer before, they're not used to deal with the cloud. Of course, they get IT support. Of course, they get maybe a vendor who builds this cloud, so they don't have to do it themselves. But nevertheless, they're not used to deal with these things. And so the risk to stumble over these new topics is high. And that's why it doesn't surprise me that I think if you look in the industry, probably the number is very high. You run just behind cost savings. Then you do technology, of course, you run behind efficiency, time to market, and other things, but then you forget to really deal with these risks which comes with the introduction of these technologies.
But still, 79% are still learning. So in your view, what do you think can be done to aid their learning?
I think partnerships is one important element. So we have also, when I look a bit of how we work, we can't solve these problems alone. So we really rely a lot on partners in order to work with that. So when I talk partners, I talk really a wide range of partners. I talk about vendors. Of course, there are many of them. Then the question is with whom. I talk about even clients. I talk even in some cases also peers, so competitors. I talk about universities, so we also work with universities. We have problems, issues we can't solve, so we sometimes work with this to do a study. Research and development centers as well. So there are a number of sources, and of course the insurers as well. Insurance might also bring at least a piece of information to the table which you don't have, which then can help to accelerate the learning, but also maybe innovate a solution around risk management, how that can be solved in a good way. So I think it requires more than just yourself. And then on the other hand, of course, you need to think about what skill sets do you need and what diversity do you need in the company, in the risk management department as also in others. What we do now much more, we work cross-departmental, so we bring people from all sorts of directions together, and we are sometimes surprised how much innovative thoughts we get out of this mix of diverse people. And also I'm talking about gender, and I'm talking also about age. The young people think different, and sometimes they bring ideas we just couldn't think of, because what happens with the older people like me, we think in the We think from the past about the future. And that, of course, is difficult because the future is not like the past. It's something new.
Brilliant. I think that brings us nicely on to the next slide.
Yes, thank you. So the two summary slides I have, on one hand, the big message here is, yes, data is very important. It's an intangible asset. I think that shows you also, why was WhatsApp bought or sold for 18 or 19 billions. I mean, an unbelievable number. It's because of the data, not because of the 25 or 30 employees and a couple of servers they had. It was the data. So important, really important, but it's not enough. It's you need much more than data. You need also the technology piece. So you need to think about, what do we need on the analytical side? What do we need on the data management side? Do we partner? Do we do it in-house? How do we deal with that? Then we need people. Skill set, but also the company culture. We need to have also thought leadership on the management. So how do we enable that by having the right people in the company? And last but not least, relationships. Partnerships, what I mentioned before, is how can we sort of accelerate the go-to-market with the right partnerships? It could be also access to the market, could be also partnership, so that you change a distribution channel for something, or it's, as I said before, research and development, or the development of new solutions. And also technology vendor can suddenly become a really interesting part, and not just to sell you the technology, but actually to do something together. Good. So that's one thing. And the second thing on the last slide is summarizing the benefits. So to step back a bit again, when we look at the benefits, why is data and technology such an important piece? First and most, what we hear is costs. So companies would not implement that if there's not some sort of a cost benefit. But there are two more things which are sort of the top of what in discussions and reports. That's just in time. So you can become much more agile in the way you manage your value chain and supply chain, but as well as the time to market. So speed to market has to increase. And I mean, just take the example of Tesla compared to the automotive industry in general. How long does Tesla need to implement a new feature in the car, and how long a traditional car maker needs? The huge differences in the amount of days. And it's not just because they have the right people, it's the whole ecosystem around how they do it enables that to do that. So, but then I believe there are three more big benefits. One is new revenue models, so data-driven revenue models, or just new digital channels, new products, whatever it is. And you see now industries really transforming, not just being in one industry, actually going to different areas, either up and down the value chain or just horizontally, thanks to digitalization. That allows you also to go closer to your clients, much closer. I mean, think of insurance. We have a problem. We are not close enough to our clients. So will digitalization allow to change that, or do we have to work with partners to get closer to clients? That's to be seen. And the last one is brand. I believe also the brand will benefit a lot by having all these possibilities from the digitalization. On the other hand, we have a lot of risks, so it doesn't come as a free lunch. Reputation is what we heard before, is a big one. Compliance, ethics, intellectual property, but then also cyber, and I call it silent cyber, which was for me also quite a new topic. You have incidents where something happens, but at the end there's a physical damage. So, for example, somebody hacks a machine, then another software goes down because of that, and then a cooling system fails because of that, and suddenly 10 turbines around the globe catch fire. That could happen, and this due to a software error or a hacking incident. That's what we call silent cyber, but the end result is a physical damage. And I believe this number will increase. I'm not saying in frequency, but I believe in severity, and that's interesting to see how we deal with that. Can we measure that? Because sometimes it's not easy also to see what was the cause, and for insurance. And last but not least, new risks. And this is an area I can't give you examples. I have just the gut feeling. I believe we will see new risks we don't know today in the area of non-damage business interruption, in the area of cyber, in the area maybe of computing, and in the area of something. So we need to have our eyes wide open and think about the steps we do in developing new business model, in developing a new technology, what might it mean for risk, and see, can we take some measures already now, or how can we learn from that, and with whom do we work together to do that? So new risks, I think, is an important one, and as we all know, speed is a topic here. Things go much faster in the past, and therefore we need to be also a bit more agile. And with that, I would like to close and get back to Kim. Thanks very much.
Freddie, thank you very much for your presentation. That brings us to the end of today's webinar. This webinar will be available on the Airmic website, and the address is on your screens now. The next webinar will be on cloud computing, and that will be presented by Kyle Burnt from Chubb. The webinar is scheduled for next Thursday at 3 o'clock. If you haven't registered, please do so now. Thank you once again for joining us for today's webinar, and I hope you found it useful.